Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Taylor and Francis, we will be discussing data sharing trends and opportunities in the humanities and social sciences. When we think about research data sharing, we often default to the STEM disciplines. Frankly, so do the humanists to a degree. But that's why we're here, because there are actually many opportunities for the HSS disciplines to cross-pollinate with data sharing techniques. Funders, as they do for the sciences, are encouraging HSS researchers to share data, and publishers like Taylor and Francis are exploring ways to develop policies around data sharing practices as well. And libraries, with the research data services they provide for the sciences, are already well positioned to support these workflows for the humanities. Joining me to discuss this in a 4-episode series are Dr. Rebecca Taylor Grant, Head of Open Data Initiatives at Taylor and Francis, and Dr. Emily Farrell, Global Commercial Director, Open Research, also at Taylor and Francis. In this second episode of our series, we look more closely at the opportunities for data sharing in the HSS fields, as well as some of the challenges. Okay, so why don't we'll move on to sort of the benefits and challenges of data sharing. And we touched on this a little bit in the first episode, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the community aspect of data sharing. How does that align with Taylor and Francis's mission to support authors and the scholarly community?
I think we always want to be guided in our approach to data policy and open research more generally by the community. So there's really not much point in us bringing in requirements and mandates for a community that aren't appropriate. So it really does have to come from researchers, from our authors, and from our editors. And I think, like, thinking about how that kind of culture change happens, or like how community brings forth new ideas about how their research should be shared. I really like Brian Nosek at the Center for Open Science has a model strategy for culture change, which you may have seen. It's shaped like a pyramid. So he talks about, like, when you're bringing in this culture change around open science, first you have to make it possible. You should make it easy. It should be normative, rewarding, and then finally required. And I think there are some kind of roles for publishers there, but I think when it comes to making things normative in a discipline, and also to an extent making them rewarding, that kind of has to come from the community. So it's not for me to say what should be normal for a historian when they're making their research public, but I am interested in facilitating that and also seeing how it's aligning with, like, the bigger movement towards open research. So I really think, like, we have to work in tandem with that community. Otherwise, I mean, firstly, we just wouldn't get uptake. Like,
Right.
authors will not come and publish in a journal that's not aligned with their needs. And so I think while we want to be supportive, like, there's only kind of so far we should go when it comes to making things required.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, though, if this would be taken on sort of initially or forever on a case-by-case basis with some of these disciplines. I mean, depending on the research and, do some kinds of research lend themselves to data sharing and others just don't? I mean, would it be an optional kind of thing?
So I think, firstly, that's certainly the perception.
Yeah.
So if you speak to an historian, they would most likely say that data sharing is not applicable to them.
Yeah.
If you spoke a bit more about maybe transparency of their kind of access to the resources that underpin their research, kind of having transparency in terms of their research methods and giving the reader insights, maybe they'd understand that a little bit more. But I do think also it's really important to note that these are not mandates at pretty much any journal at the moment. So there are very, very few places where an historian would go to publish and find they were being required to do something that
Right.
they weren't expecting. And I think that is because we are kind of tracking with kind of progress in the different disciplines. So maybe you'd see an archaeology journal or a linguistics journal would be more likely to have that policy because it's acceptable to that community. The authors might expect it, the editors might be very supportive of it. So
Hmm.
it's kind of naturally happening. Like these things are slowly rolling out, and it is quite discipline dependent still.
Okay, excellent. Emily, so you recently published a co-authored book on a research project that combined several sets of ethnographic data. Can you describe that project in more detail and explain how evaluating multiple data sets benefited it?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. So yes, I was part of a book that published this year. There were six of us, six co-authors. So we wrote the book together, which was quite a process. And I think we started it when my son was 6 months old, and he turned 7 next week. And the book was published in
Oh, wow.
July. So it was a process that sort of took longer than your average single authored book. But what we did was the six of us had all done research previously in using a sort of sociolinguistic or an applied linguistic approach to looking at language and migration in Australia. So we broadly had, a similar sort of societal context, but each of us had looked at different aspects of that and different communities of taking ethnographic and interview approaches to kind of understanding what it is, particularly to move somewhere as an adult, to learn another language, to live in another language, and the sorts of challenges and the challenges that people face and the ways that they kind of reinvent themselves in a new language and raise kids and find work and do all those sorts of things. And all six of these projects were very much sort of situated working with very small groups of people, as you usually do with ethnographic work. And the challenge always with that is that while you can often say very specific things about specific groups of people, it is difficult to then, so you have the sort of generalizability problem. You can't really talk more broadly about, well, what does that say about migration across the world and how it intersects with language learning? So what we wanted to do was bring these six studies together to try to, rather than just rely on larger quantitative data sets like census data, be able to bring these really sort of granular, really rich sets of data together to be able to say more about what's going on for people when they move to live in a new language. It's called Life in a New Language. It was published by Oxford University Press, and it was a really incredible experience because in the end we covered 130 different people in the study, and it covered a span of 20 years. So really something that would have been really difficult to do on your own as a single researcher. And it meant that we could sort of make some sort of broader statements about what it is to sort of live a life in a new language. But we also face some real challenges in doing that, especially because it's ethnographic data. And even though all of us had worked together in different ways before, and the principal investigator on all six studies was the same, we still had to work out how to provide enough context to each other for each of the data sets. We had to unify the ways that we transcribed our data. The data was collected in different languages. So it took quite a lot of work to bring it together. So it was a really interesting process of trying to work out how you take this sort of qualitative data and kind of unify it, provide enough context, make sure you're working from the same frameworks, and then say something out of it. So I don't know that it answered all of the questions on, well, this is how you would do this if you were going about it yourself. But it definitely, I think, allowed us to make some bigger generalizations and show that there's a lot of power in doing that. But also, raise some really interesting questions around how would we recommend other researchers do that? How do you ensure that you provide enough context for your data set if you're just putting it in a repository, for instance, with this sort of data? How do you make sure that you are taking care of any kind of ethical concerns around identification in these data sets? So it was a really fantastic experience, and one that
Hmm.
I would recommend, but not one that is easy.
Right, right. So, Rebecca, you have a background in history, and can you share some of the concerns, on maybe more of a practical matter or even existential, I guess, like concerns of humanists regarding data sharing. For example, as Emily just mentioned, repositories, and copyrighted data and that kind of thing.
Yeah, my bachelor's degree is in art history, but I then trained as an archivist, and my PhD is actually in archival science. So I feel
Okay.
like I've seen both sides of the coin. So I've been a researcher working with archival sources, but then being the curator who is attempting to disseminate these sources in the world. Um, I think the kind of key challenge in history, at least, is what we've alluded to before, which is understanding the overlap between an archival source, which is often physical, and a data set. And I think even if you get to the point where you understand that this archival source is what some might consider to be your data set, what are you being asked to do with it? So you'll see in a lot of policies around data sharing, there are recommendations around uploading your data to a repository, assigning an open license to it, citing it using a persistent identifier.
Hmm.
And if you have used a physical source, even if you'd made your own photographs of it when you went into the archives to use the content, you really don't have permission to do that. And I think most researchers would really shy away from the idea of kind of thinking this through in the context of copyright law. Like, you just don't want to get tangled up in that kind of challenge around just understanding what you can and can't do. So I think, again, this comes back to the way that we describe what's needed as policymakers when it comes to data sharing, because it's really not helpful to tell an historian, please upload this data to a data repository. It just won't make any sense,
Hmm.
and they won't have permission. They
Right.
definitely shouldn't be doing that. And then maybe the more existential side is the why. So I think a lot of data sharing policy is underpinned by this idea of reproducibility, and a lot of humanists would just completely disagree that that's even relevant to them. So I think some are quite interested in the idea of reproducibility in the humanities, but many others would say this is not relevant and not something we should be striving for. So, how do you communicate why on earth you would be spending time doing this?
Right.
And I think in my own experience, undertaking a PhD in archival science, as I was kind of preparing to write my methodology chapter, I did a lot of reading around the history of my discipline and discussions around rigor. And also, is it even a discipline? Is it a research discipline? And how can we increase the rigor? And I think this is where this idea of data sharing, of robustness, of being able to be transparent about your methods can be quite compelling.
Hmm.
And I think that that can support the argument. But I think it can depend on the individual researcher. Like, what do you find to be the compelling reason that you would get involved in open research and data sharing?
Hmm. And then Emily, similar question. I mean, is it similar in the social sciences in terms of data sharing? Sensitive data and that kind of thing.
There are definitely some similarities. I think there's certainly the sensitivity around, I think even in the qualitative social sciences, you usually have to do a human ethics approval,
Hmm.
which I found quite bizarre when I did it, which is a good while ago now. But having to fill out a form that was clearly created for people working in more, I guess, more STEM disciplines, sort of asking about how you would dispose of tissue samples and so forth, which was not what I was going to be doing. So, I've been doing interviews with people. It's not going to cause that sort of dilemma.
Right.
But I think that one of the challenges, I think, is that often if you have a very rich, large data set that includes field notes and diaries and lengthy interviews over many years, if you've done a longitudinal study or an ethnographic study, that often you'll write your PhD and then there's still so much in that data set that you want to do more with, you want to write more on. And I don't know that scooping is necessarily the right word, because I feel like that sort of is more in STEM, where you're perhaps trying to find a cure for something. But really the fact that you want to be the one that's doing the research out of your data. And so if you're putting it in a repository, does that mean that somebody else is going to come and use your data in a way that you just haven't had a chance to get to yet? So I think that there's that as a concern. I think, again, what we were speaking about earlier around context and ensuring that your data, that anyone that's coming to your data outside of your research community understands exactly where and why and how that data has been collected. I think that's a challenge that people are concerned about. And some of the ethical sort of, making sure that the people in your study aren't identifiable. I mean, I think most people that are doing ethnographic work de-identify their data and anonymize participants, but there's a concern that I think too with what's the right way to put it, triangulation, I suppose, in that if you have a lot of rich ethnographic data sets out there that are available, that if you put those all together with all of the other identifying information on the internet, you are going to be able to identify participants. And does that bring up sort of ethical questions for you as the primary researcher? So I think some of these things, need to be, I think those are some of the dilemmas that researchers that are considering this are facing.
You just heard from Dr. Rebecca Taylor Grant, Head of Open Data Initiatives at Taylor & Francis, and Dr. Emily Farrell, Global Commercial Director, Open Research, also at Taylor & Francis. Join us next week when we talk about how specific policies that govern data sharing are being developed and the resources that are being made available to researchers to encourage them to join in on the open data environment. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Taylor & Francis. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.